Retirement was supposed to be simple. That's what all the brochures said. That's what the guys at the job site said when they punched out for the last time. Sell the house. Cash out whatever you've got left. Find a place where the weather's kinder, the money lasts longer, and nobody asks what you used to be. I thought I was buying peace. She thought I was buying her future. It took me years to understand that those two ideas can look identical at the beginning. My name is Clarence. I'm 63 years old, born and raised in the Midwest, blue collar to the bone. I spent most of my life working logistics and warehouse management, forklifts, loading docks, shipping schedules, broken pallets, busted backs, honest work, loud work. The kind of work where you don't have to talk about your feelings because you're too tired to pretend you have any left. I was married for 30 years, long enough to build a life that looks solid from the outside. House, 2 cars, a garage full of tools I swore I'd organize someday, long enough to believe that if you just keep showing up, things will hold together on their own. They don't. The divorce wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches, no affairs exposed at dinner. Just 2 people who realized they'd been roommates longer than partners. Lawyers got involved, fees piled up. By the time the papers were signed, half my savings were gone, and the house we'd built together belonged to memories I wasn't invited to anymore. I told myself I wasn't bitter. Maybe that was true. Or maybe bitterness just gets quieter when you're exhausted. I sold what I didn't need, cashed out what I had. When the dust settled, I was staring at numbers on a screen that were supposed to represent freedom. They didn't feel like much, enough to survive, not enough to stay comfortable in the United States, not with rent climbing and healthcare feeling like a gamble every year you get older. That's when Mexico started showing up in my searches. Not the tourist Mexico, not the postcard beaches, real places. Mexico City, Puebla, Guadalajara. Places where people lived normal lives. Places where expats said your money went further, where rent didn't eat you alive, where you could disappear into a routine without anyone asking too many questions. I wasn't chasing adventure. I was chasing quiet. I spent months researching visas, healthcare, neighborhoods, watching videos at night with the sound low so the house didn't echo, reading forum posts written by men who sounded a lot like me. Divorced, retired, tired, looking for somewhere softer to land. Mexico City felt overwhelming. Guadalajara felt too polished. Puebla kept coming up as manageable, slower, historic, affordable, close enough to the capital to matter, far enough away to breathe. I booked a one-way flight. The night before I left, I stood in my empty living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Fear. Real fear. The kind that reminds you you're still alive. I told myself it was excitement. I needed it to be excitement. When I landed in Mexico, the air hit me first. Thicker, warmer, alive. The airport buzzed in a way American airports don't. Families hugging, vendors calling out, noise that felt human instead of mechanical. I remember thinking, this could work, it has to work. The bus ride to Puebla cut through neighborhoods that didn't pretend to be anything else. Concrete houses stacked tight, small tiendas on corners, kids kicking soccer balls in narrow streets. I watched it all like a man watching a movie about someone else's life. I'd rented a small apartment sight unseen, 2 rooms, basic furniture, white tile floors, a balcony that looked out over a street with an OXXO on the corner, and a taqueria that smelled better than anything I'd cooked for myself in years. The rent was less than what I used to pay for cable. For the first time since the divorce, my chest loosened. I built routines quickly. Morning coffee at a little cafe down the block. Same table, same order. Afternoons walking the neighborhood, learning which streets were loud and which stayed calm. Evenings eating wherever looked busy. Trusting the crowd more than my instincts. I wasn't trying to become Mexican. I was trying not to feel invisible. That's where I met her. She worked a morning shift at the cafe. Early 20s. Dark hair pulled back. No makeup beyond what life puts on your face when you don't sleep enough. She moved fast behind a counter. Efficient. Focused. But when things slowed, she'd talk. At first, it was nothing. Small questions. Where I was from. How long I was staying, whether I liked Puebla. I told her the truth. I was new. I liked the quiet. I liked that nobody cared who I used to be. You came alone? She asked one morning, refilling my coffee before I'd finished it. I nodded. Easier that way. She smiled, but there was something behind it. Not flirtation, curiosity. The kind you get when someone doesn't fit neatly into a category. Her name was Daniela. She worked mornings at the cafe and evenings at a small office doing basic admin work. She was studying part-time business classes when she could afford them. Nothing fancy, just trying to build something better than what she'd grown up with. She told me about her family outside the city, about helping her parents when she could, about stretching semesters because tuition didn't care how hard you worked. She never complained. She just stated facts the way people do when complaining feels pointless. I listened more than I talked. It felt good to be listened to, too. To have someone ask about my life without knowing the parts that embarrassed me. She didn't know about the divorce, the failed business, the quiet house back home. To her, I was just Clarence, a man who drank coffee too slowly and spoke Spanish, like every sentence was a small negotiation. Weeks passed, conversations got longer, less surface, more honest. She talked about wanting stability, not luxury, about being tired of struggling but not wanting to depend on anyone. I believed her. Or maybe I believed what I needed to believe. When she mentioned struggling to pay for her next semester, I felt something shift inside me, not desire, purpose. The old instinct to fix, to provide, to be useful again. I told myself it was just help, nothing more. I didn't see the line I was stepping over, not yet. And as I walked back to my apartment that night, past the OXXO lights and the sounds of the street settling into evening, I remember thinking something that should have scared me more than it did. For the first time in a long time, someone needs me. I didn't ask myself why that mattered so much. I just let it. I told myself I was just being kind. That's how it always starts. Not with some grand plan or reckless promise, just small decisions that feel reasonable when you make them one at a time. Daniela didn't ask for help directly. That's what made it easier. She mentioned deadlines the way people mention the weather. Tuition due dates. Books that cost more than a week's pay. A cracked phone she kept using because it still worked if you tilted it just right. I listened. I nodded. I told myself I understood because I'd known struggle too, just as a different currency. When I finally offered to help pay for one semester, it came out almost casually, like I was offering to grab lunch. Her reaction surprised me. She froze. Then she shook her head hard, like the answer needed to come from her body, before her mouth caught up. "No," she said. "I can't take money from you." I smiled, trying to make it lighter than it felt. "It's not charity. Think of it like an advance on future success." She laughed at that, but her eyes didn't. They were wet, embarrassed, conflicted. She told me she didn't want to owe anyone, that she'd seen what dependence did to people, to families. I told her I wasn't asking for anything back. No strings. Just help. That was true. In the narrow sense, I wasn't thinking about returns or leverage or obligation. I was thinking about how it felt to matter again, to make a difference that wasn't measured in pallets moved or schedules met. I transferred the money that afternoon. It wasn't a huge amount by American standards, a few $1,000s. But the way she reacted, you'd think I'd handed her the keys to a new life. She hugged me outside the cafe, quick and awkward, like she wasn't sure what kind of embrace this was supposed to be. People walked past us. Nobody stared. Nobody cared. I told myself that was a good sign. From then on, things shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, just closer. She started joining me for walks after her shifts. We'd stop at Mercados and she'd explain which stalls were worth trusting and which ones weren't. She showed me her neighborhood. Not the polished streets near the center, but the ones with uneven sidewalks and kids doing homework on plastic tables outside their homes. I noticed how often people greeted her, how she carried responsibility like a second bag over her shoulder. She told me about her parents' debts, about cousins who borrowed money they never repaid, about the pressure of being the one who made it far enough to be expected to help everyone else climb. "I don't want to be rescued," she said one night as we sat on a bench near a small park, the city humming around us. "I just want a chance." I believed her. Or maybe I believed in her. There's a difference, and I didn't know it yet. A few months later, she graduated. The ceremony was held in a hot gymnasium that smelled like sweat and floor cleaner. Plastic chairs, families packed shoulder to shoulder. I sat with her parents, smiling and nodding through conversations I half understood. They thanked me more than once, their gratitude sincere and overwhelming. I felt proud. Proud in a way that had nothing to do with ego, and everything to do with feeling connected to something bigger than myself. Afterward, Daniela hugged me longer than before. "You changed my life," she said quietly. I didn't correct her. I let the words land where they wanted. 2 weeks later, she asked me to meet her after the cafe closed. She arrived carrying a folder thick with papers and a laptop that had clearly lived a hard life. We sat at our usual table, the lights dimmed, the street outside quieter than normal. "I've been working on something," she said, opening the folder. What followed was a presentation. Not flashy, but thorough. A small business plan focused on internet services and basic tech training. Puebla had plenty of outdated cyber cafes, she explained, slow connections, old equipment. Students needed better access. Small businesses needed printing, scanning, reliable internet. She'd done the research, costs, location options, revenue projections, break-even points. I was impressed, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, grounded, thought through. "We could do this together," she said, pointing to a line on the page. "You invest. I manage operations. We split profits." She said we like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the numbers, but what I was really seeing was myself 6 months earlier. Alone, drifting. No reason to wake up before noon. Now here was a reason, a project, a role. I asked what she needed. She told me the number. It was significant, but not devastating. Less than 10% of what I had left. Enough to matter, but not enough to ruin me. That's how it felt at the time. I said yes. We moved fast. Too fast, if I'm being honest. She found a small shop space near the university. Foot traffic, students, offices nearby. I went with her to meet the landlord. Contracts were explained to me in Spanish. I only half followed, but Daniela translated confidently. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She'd never given me a reason not to. The money went into her account. She said it was easier that way, less paperwork for a foreigner. That made sense. At least it did then. The first month was good, really good. We spent long days setting up computers, arranging furniture, testing printers. I helped where I could. Organization, basic systems, things I knew. On opening day, people lined up. Students, freelancers, small business owners. Daniela moved through the space like she belonged there. Switching languages, solving problems, smiling when things went wrong. I stood behind the counter and felt useful. For the first time since my working life ended, I wasn't just killing time. She showed me receipts, talked about growth, ideas for classes, expansion. I started imagining a future that wasn't just survival, something modest, something meaningful. Then the small things started, little inconsistencies, numbers that didn't quite line up with what I'd seen, days that felt quieter than the report suggested. When I asked questions, Daniela answered quickly, confidently, sometimes too quickly. "Yesterday was busy," she'd say. "Today is slow. It happens." I wanted to believe that. Businesses fluctuate. I knew that better than most. When I suggested bringing in an accountant, her mood shifted. "Why?" she asked. "Don't you trust me?" The question landed heavier than it should have. I backpedaled. Told her it was about professionalism, not suspicion. About doing things right. She nodded, but something cooled between us. A few weeks later, she came to me with another idea. A bigger location. Better area. More visibility. More money. She showed me photos. Projections. Urgency. "We have to move fast," she said. "This won't wait." The number was bigger this time. Big enough to make my stomach tighten. I hesitated. Her expression changed. Not anger, disappointment. "I thought you believed in me," she said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was personal. I told myself this was what trust looked like. That fear was just old habits trying to keep me small. I agreed. I sent the money. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, listening to the city through the open window. Cars, voices, distant music. For the first time since arriving in Mexico, I felt something I didn't want to name. A quiet, crawling doubt. I told myself it was nerves. I didn't know yet that it was instinct trying to catch up. And somewhere between that transfer confirmation and the sunrise, something shifted that I wouldn't be able to undo. After that second transfer, the tone changed. Not overnight, not in a way I could point to and say, That's where it broke. It was more like humidity creeping into walls. Everything still looked solid, but something is slowly softening underneath. The new location was almost ready. There were permits to finalize. A landlord who suddenly needed more time. A cousin handling paperwork at an office that moved at its own pace. Daniela explained it all with the same calm confidence she'd always had. "This is Mexico," she'd say with a small shrug. "Things don't move like they do in the US." She wasn't wrong. I'd already learned that patience was part of daily life here. Lines took longer, offices closed early, answers changed depending on who you asked. So when she said delays were normal, I nodded. I wanted to nod. Meanwhile, the original shop started changing in quieter ways. The hours shortened. Some days I'd walk by in the afternoon and find the lights off, the metal gate pulled halfway down. When I asked, Daniela had reasons ready. Slow days, staff issues, new competition. All of it sounded plausible. On paper. But my gut didn't live on paper. I started stopping by unannounced. Not to catch her in anything, at least that's what I told myself, but to feel connected, to stay involved. The energy was different. Fewer customers, less urgency. Daniela wasn't always there. When she was, she seemed distracted. On her phone more? Stepping outside to take calls, she didn't explain. I reminded myself that stress changes people. That she was carrying a lot, that I'd invested not just money, but belief. And belief requires patience. When I asked again about formal accounting, about sitting down with numbers that matched the reality I was seeing, she sighed. "You're acting different," she said. "Like you don't see me as a partner anymore." That word again, partner. It had weight, emotional weight. It wrapped itself around my doubts and squeezed. I apologized. That should have been my warning sign. A few days later, she came to me, asking for more money. Not for expansion this time, for operations. Just enough to cover staff, utilities, rent, just until things stabilized. The number wasn't enormous, but it wasn't small either. Something in me finally stopped nodding. "No," I said, calmly, steadier than I felt. "Not until I see real financial statements. Everything, rent, revenue, expenses." She didn't cry this time. She went quiet. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the small table in my apartment. The city noise drifted into the window. A bus braking. Someone laughing on the street. Then I saw it. Not anger. Not sadness. Calculation. It was brief. Just a flicker. But once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll prepare everything." She stood up, smoothed her shirt, and kissed my cheek on the way out. The gesture felt automatic. Performed. Days passed. No documents. Excuses came instead. Files that needed updating. An accountant who was busy. A power outage that wiped a computer. My unease hardened into something heavier. One afternoon, I went to the shop and found it locked. Not closed early. Locked. A handwritten note taped to the gate said, "Back soon." I waited. An hour passed. Then another. No one came. I walked down the street and spoke to the neighboring business owner. A man who'd watched the place open with interest, then confusion. "She hasn't been here much lately," he told me. "And the landlord has been asking around." That sentence sat in my chest like a stone. I found the landlord's number and called him. He answered immediately. When I told him who I was, there was a pause. "You're the partner?" he asked. "Yes." Rent hadn't been paid in 2 months. He'd been patient. More patient than he should have been. But he was done waiting. That was the moment the story I'd been telling myself collapsed. Not dramatically. Quietly, like a shelf giving way under weight it was never meant to hold. I confronted Daniela that evening. Not at the cafe. Not at the shop. At her apartment. She opened the door already crying like she'd been expecting me. Like she'd rehearsed this version of the moment. The story spilled out fast. Too fast. The business struggled. She panicked. Family emergencies, debts she hadn't told me about. Pressure from all sides. She meant to fix it. She meant to tell me. She just needed time. The second location money was gone. Not invested. Spent. Her words blurred together. Tears. Apologies. Promises. "I was going to pay you back," she said. "I swear." I listened. I really did. I wanted to find something solid in the explanation. Some version where this was just mismanagement. A bad run of luck. But it wasn't adding up. Over the next few days, I started asking questions I should have asked months earlier. other expats, local business owners, people who'd seen versions of this story before. The business license had never been properly filed. The equipment had been rented short-term. Some of the expenses she'd claimed didn't exist at all, and Daniela wasn't new to this. She'd approached other older foreigners before. Not always with businesses, sometimes with school fees, sometimes with family emergencies, always with the same arc: hope, trust, pressure, disappearance. I did the math alone in my apartment, staring at numbers that felt unreal. Nearly $50,000, a quarter of what I had left, gone. When I confronted her again, the tone changed completely. She didn't beg this time. She was cold, defensive. "You'll never understand what it's like to be poor," she said. "You always have a way out." Then she was gone, blocked, disappeared. No forwarding address, no apology worth believing. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, the city outside still moving, still alive, and felt something worse than anger. I felt small, not because I'd lost money, because I'd lost trust in myself. I'd come to Mexico looking for quiet, for simplicity, for a life where my past mistakes didn't follow me. Instead, I'd recreated them in a new language. And as I stared at the ceiling, doing the math over and over again, one question kept looping through my head, heavier each time it came back. At 63, how many restarts do you really get? I didn't have an answer, only a plane ticket I hadn't planned to buy, and the sinking realization that the hardest part was still ahead. I didn't leave Mexico right away. For a while, I just stayed where I was, moving through my days like someone else was controlling my body. I still walked past the cafe in the mornings, though I stopped going in. I still passed the OXXO at night, the same one where Daniela and I had laughed about the strange snacks and the lottery tickets people bought with such hope. The city hadn't changed. I had. Every decision felt heavier now. Not just about money, about trust, about my own judgment. When you're young, you can blame mistakes on inexperience. When you're my age, there's nowhere to hide. You're supposed to know better. I talked to a lawyer in Puebla, a small office above a print shop, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a fan that clicked when it turned. He listened patiently, nodded in the right places, and then told me the truth in a voice that didn't sugarcoat anything. Pursuing legal action would cost money I didn't have, time I couldn't afford, and even then, there was no guarantee I'd recover anything. The money was likely gone, scattered across debts and hands I'd never be able to trace. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the best decision is knowing when to stop digging." I walked out into the street and felt something settle in me, not acceptance, resignation. The math was unavoidable. With what I had left, I couldn't stay in Mexico long term. Not safely, not comfortably. One medical emergency, one unexpected expense, and I'd be trapped. So I sold what little I'd bought: furniture, appliances, things that had made the apartment feel temporary, because in some quiet part of me I think I'd always known it was. The day I left Puebla, I stood on the balcony one last time watching the street wake up. Vendors setting up carts, buses honking, life continuing without me. Mexico hadn't failed me, I'd failed myself. The flight back to the United States felt longer than the one that brought me there. Not because of distance, but because I was carrying everything I'd tried to leave behind. Shame, regret, the quiet knowledge that I'd gambled my future on the feeling of being needed. I landed with 2 suitcases and a plan that barely deserved the name. I rented a small studio in a town I used to drive through without noticing. Thin walls, cheap carpet, a view of a parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was what I could afford. At 63, I applied for a job at a hardware store. The interview lasted 10 minutes. The manager didn't ask about my past, just whether I could lift boxes and show up on time. I could. The work was humbling. Not because it was beneath me, but because it reminded me how far I'd fallen from who I thought I was supposed to be at this age. I stocked shelves, answered questions, smiled at customers who didn't know or care that I'd once run teams and budgets and logistics chains. The paycheck was small. Combined with a modest pension, it was just enough to get by. At first, I went home exhausted in the same way I used to when I was younger. The difference was that now the exhaustion came with silence. No one waiting, no one asking how my day was. Started attending a support group for people who'd been victims of financial fraud. Mostly older folks, different stories, same ending, trust misplaced, futures altered. When it was my turn to speak, my voice shook more than I expected. The hardest part, I told them, wasn't losing the money. It was losing faith in my own judgment. Heads nodded. Understanding passed through the room like a shared breath. An older woman named Margaret spoke after me. She said something that stuck. Being trusting isn't a flaw, she said. It's a risk, and risks don't always pay off. That doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human. I wanted to believe her. Some days I do. Other days, I replay every moment, every red flag I ignored, every excuse I accepted because it felt better than being alone. I still think about Mexico, about Puebla, about the man I was when I arrived there, hopeful and tired and open in a way I didn't know was dangerous. I don't regret the place. I regret confusing being needed with being loved. At my age, starting over isn't about rebuilding everything. It's about learning what not to carry forward. I carry less now. Less money. Less certainty. But also fewer illusions. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Dignity doesn't come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from standing back up after you've made them. I'm still standing. And some days, that has to be enough. For a long time after I came back, I didn't tell anyone the full story. Not my kids, not my coworkers, not even the people at the support group. At least not all of it. I learned quickly that when you say you lost money overseas, people stop listening for details. They jump straight to judgment or pity, sometimes both. So I shortened it. Bad investment, trusted the wrong person, didn't work out. Those sentences were easier to carry than the truth. The truth was heavier. The truth was that nothing about what happened felt sudden when I looked back on it. It felt inevitable, like a slow drift toward a wall. I didn't notice until I hit it. Every step made sense on its own. Every decision had a reason that sounded responsible at the time. That's what scares me now. Not that I was fooled, but how gently it happened. Back in the US, my days settled into something predictable. Work, home, dinner alone, sleep. On my days off, I walked. No destination, just movement. I found that if I kept my body busy, my mind behaved better. Sometimes, though, memories slipped through. The cafe in Puebla. The sound of cups on saucers. The way Daniela said my name like it mattered. I tried not to turn her into a villain in my head. That would have been easier, maybe. But it wouldn't have been honest. She was young, pressured, cornered by expectations I'd never had to live under. That didn't excuse what she did, but it explained enough to stop me from hating her. And that was important, because if I let hatred take over, it would mean I'd learned the wrong lesson. The real danger wasn't Mexico. It wasn't her age. It wasn't even the money. It was the part of me that wanted to be needed so badly that I mistook access for affection. I started seeing that pattern everywhere once I named it, in other people's stories, in my own past. In the way some men talk about starting fresh, like geography can reset emotional debts. I'd moved countries, but I hadn't moved past myself. That realization hurt more than the financial loss. One night at the support group, a man about my age asked me something that caught me off guard. If you could go back, he said, would you do it again? Move abroad, I mean. I didn't answer right away. The room was quiet. Everyone waited, maybe expecting a warning, a hard no. But that wasn't the truth either. I would, I said slowly. But I'd go for different reasons. I'd gone to escape quiet. I'd gone to outrun failure. I'd gone hoping to feel chosen again. If I ever travel like that again, and I don't know if I will, it won't be to be saved from loneliness. It'll be to sit with it without trying to buy my way out. That's the part nobody tells you. Money doesn't just create opportunity, it creates imbalance. And imbalance changes the rules of every relationship, whether you admit it or not. These days, I'm more careful, not just with money, but with stories I tell myself. When something feels too affirming too fast, I slow down. When I feel flattered, I ask why. I don't assume bad intentions. I just assume complexity. My kids and I talk more now, not about the past, but about the present, about ordinary things. It's not perfect, but it's real. And real has become more important to me than ideal. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that version of myself stepping off the plane in Mexico, convinced he was finally doing something brave. In a way, he was. He just didn't know courage without boundaries can turn into self-erasure. If there's wisdom in what I went through, and I'm still not sure there is it, this starting over doesn't mean starting empty. You bring yourself with you, your habits, your hungers, your blind spots. If you don't face those, they'll find you anywhere. I didn't lose everything. I lost illusions. I lost comfort. I lost time I can't get back. What I gained came slower. Clarity, humility, a quieter kind of self-respect. At my age, that has to count for something. And if someone listening to this hears their own thoughts, echoing in mine if they're planning a move, a relationship, a fresh start somewhere far away, I won't tell them not to go. I'll just say this: don't confuse being wanted with being valued. Don't confuse generosity with intimacy. And don't hand someone else the responsibility of giving your life meaning. That part has to stay with you. I'm still rebuilding, still working, still learning. And maybe that's what retirement was always supposed to be. Not an escape, but a reckoning. One you finally have the time to face.